Hello again, this is United States History 201, Presentation 2, Virginia and the Cavaliers. So what we're going to talk about today is the first presentation in the settlement of the British North American colonies. And of course we start with Virginia. Now oftentimes you've probably heard in your life that the first colony settled by the English in North America was the Plymouth colony, and that you had the famous Pilgrims coming over on the Mayflower, and of course they established themselves here and were able to have the first Thanksgiving in Plymouth, giving thanks that the Indian tribes in the area helped them out and helped them survive the winter, and the rest is history. But of course this is all untrue. The first colony settled by the English in North America was Virginia. The first Thanksgiving was held in Virginia. The other myth that you might often hear is that the first civil government was in Plymouth. It's not true. The first civil government in North America was the Virginia colony. So Virginia was first in everything, but because of the way that history has progressed, at least the telling of history has progressed in the last 300 years, particularly in the last 150 years, you get this myth that Plymouth was somehow first. But Virginia was the first. So we're going to start with that. We'll also talk about what's called Cavalier Culture. So what we're going to do in these next four presentations is talk about the dominant culture types in the different sections in North America. So the main thing out of that is that the idea that there was a sectional conflict that somehow was fabricated out of thin air in the 19th century is just completely preposterous. There were sections in the colonial North America, and there were different cultures in the colonies, and this is essentially what led to the conflict that later turned into war in 1861. These cultural differences that had been there for, at that point, a couple of hundred years. So, as I said, there are four dominant cultures in British North America between 1578 and 1732, and then forward as well. But they're the Cavaliers, the Puritans, the Friends, who are the Quakers, and the Celts. And you also had different types of colonies in this period of time. You had what were called royal colonies and proprietary colonies. Royal colonies essentially were set up by the crown, so they controlled the everyday activities of the colonies. They appointed the governors. They had complete control over the economic and legal and social functions of the colonies, theoretically. But because the crown did directly appoint the governor, they had tremendous control of these colonies. Now, proprietary colonies were different. Proprietary colonies were established by private individuals or corporations, and they chose the governors. They chose the legislative responsibilities of the colonies, and so in that way it was private individuals having control of the colonies. Now, most of the colonies started as proprietary colonies and then later turned into royal colonies, which means that the colonies were founded through free enterprise, through initiative of private individuals. Now, theoretically, they're given a grant of land from the king to establish this colony, but still these corporations or entities, private entities, would then be in charge of setting the colony up and managing its well-being. So when the colonists said, we got here on our own blood and hook, they meant it. They were doing this on their own without really any intervention from the government. But when the colonies became difficult to manage at times, they would often turn them over to the crown, and the crown would have direct control of the colony itself. Now, there were several reasons for migration to these British North American colonies. Religious persecution is one you often hear about, and this was predominant in the North and Middle colonies with the Quakers and the Pilgrims. Also, the Puritans were not persecuted per se in England at this point in particular, but they were looking to have some type of new society, which is the next thing. So you might have had people wanting to look for create some type of new society, a utopian type idea. This would be also in the North and Middle colonies. Many of the people came here looking for wealth. This was dominant in the South. People were coming here to make money, to have a large estate, to live like they did in England. And so you had this predominantly with the Cavaliers, also with the Celts a little bit. And then also because of the right of primogeniture entail, this forced many of your gentry, members of the gentry who could not have a landed estate in England because of primogeniture. What that means is that the oldest son gets all the land when the father dies, and the younger sons get nothing. So in order to live that way, these younger sons would have to go on to the British North American colonies. Now, Sir Walter Raleigh was the first Englishman to settle in North America, or at least establish a settlement in North America. He lived between 1554 and 1618. He personally financed an attempt to settle in Virginia, named Virginia after the Virgin Queen, Queen Elizabeth I. And he did this in 1584 and 1587. Both of these colonies failed. In fact, the 1587 colony is also often known as the Lost Colony of Roanoke. And that's because the Englishmen could not get back for a couple of years. When they finally returned, there was nothing left of the colony but some remnants that this colony had once been here. It must be noted that the first English child was born in North America in this lost colony. Her name was Virginia Dare. Raleigh was an important guy, had a lot of money, and was able to, again, personally, with his own money, finance a colonial expedition 2 times. So the English stayed out of North America for about 20 years, and then in 1607 they again attempted to settle another colony, and this was known as Jamestown. In fact, this colony would survive. So Jamestown, founded in 1607, was the first permanent English colony in North America. Not the first permanent European colony in North America, that was St. Augustine. Jamestown was the first permanent English colony in North America, founded April 26, 1607 on the James River, named after King James, and of course the settlement Jamestown, also named after King James. This is in the Tidewater region of Virginia, so it's swampy, there's not much food, there's a brackish water, which is a mixture of salt and fresh water, a lot of disease, starvation was a problem, also Indian problems there. In fact, in the first 7 months, 73 of the original 105 settlers would die. So this is a very difficult expedition. I can equate it today to maybe going to the moon and trying to establish a colony there. This is just as dangerous because when they got here, of course, they didn't have to deal with the atmospheric problems, but they didn't know what they would find, if they would be able to get food, shelter, survive, if they would be attacked by Indian tribes, which did happen. So this is a very difficult situation for these early colonials. And of course, if you can look at my mouse, Jamestown is down here, and it's on the James River. It's again in the Tidewater area of Virginia, just off the Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic Ocean. And this is what the fort looked like, James Fort at Jamestown. You can see they have the palisades established with the firing positions in the corners, and of course they lived in the interior of the fort, but they did farm often on the exterior of the fort. Now, the most important settler at Jamestown was a man named Captain John Smith, who lived from 1579 to 1631. Now, Smith really was the first American hero. He was an author, a soldier of fortune, explorer, wrote a book entitled The History of Virginia. He was the president of Jamestown in September of 1607, and during that time he developed a compulsory work program based on the biblical verse, "He who does not work shall not eat." So the idea was that when these first settlers were here, a lot of them didn't want to work. They wanted to go around and look for gold because that's what they thought they would have. And they were mostly men, and they had their body servants, but they didn't find much. And so Smith became frustrated at this, and so he said, look, if you don't work, you don't eat, you don't survive. So this is a harsh penalty, but again, there was no handouts here, no welfare. These men had to make it themselves, and if they weren't contributing, they deserved to perish. That's the way Smith looked at it. Of course, Smith is also responsible for trying to establish self-sustaining agriculture, the idea that these people can grow stuff and survive. But the most famous image that we have of Captain John Smith is the legend of Pocahontas. Pocahontas, pictured there, this is the only remaining picture of Pocahontas. This is a portrait that was actually made of her, so much different than the Disney version. She was the daughter of Chief Powhatan of the Virginia Tidewater Indians, lived from 1595 to 1617. And according to legend, she saved John Smith from execution as a young girl. She was about 12 years old. And she supposedly jumped on top of John Smith and saved him from having his head bashed in. Now, whether this was a kind of a ritual where Smith was kind of welcomed into the Tidewater tribe, or if Smith was actually going to be killed, nobody knows. She later converted to Christianity and changed her name to Rebecca, so she was known as Lady Rebecca in England. And in 1614, she married John Rolfe. Pocahontas actually died in England. She went to travel there and then died. But the marriage of Rolfe and Pocahontas would actually produce children, and many prominent Virginians trace their lineage to Rolfe and Pocahontas. So this union actually helped populate Virginia. In fact, John Rolfe was an important guy because he introduced tobacco to Virginia in 1614. And this plant made the colony profitable and led to plantation agriculture. It also led to indentured servants and slaves. The first first African slaves, I should say, were imported in 1619. It's also 1619 was also an important year because 1619 was the first year that you had an elected legislature in British colonial North America. It's also the first Thanksgiving was held in 1619 in Virginia. So Virginia had those firsts. So Thanksgiving 2 years before the Pilgrims did in Massachusetts. Now there was some internal discord in Virginia. In fact, there was a very famous Virginian named Nathaniel Bacon who lived from 1647 to 1676. He led what's called Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. Essentially what happened is that Bacon lived on the frontier, and there were some problems. First of all, the Crown was not protecting the colonists like they believed they should. There were Indian problems on the frontier. Taxes were very high. And you had indentured servants on the frontier who didn't think they were getting the land that they were promised. So essentially what happened is that this was a tax revolt, and a revolt against the lax defensive policies of the colonial governor. And so these men, led by Bacon, rebelled against the Crown, threw out the governor, and established a government for a very short period of time in Williamsburg in 1676. Bacon would die within a few weeks after the rebellion takes place, and so these men would have to leave. And some of them would be executed, but many would be pardoned. Now, let's talk about the dominant culture in Virginia for much of colonial history and even forward, even into the 19th century. This is Cavalier culture. The Cavaliers are members of the British or English upper class, typically called the gentry, who supported the king during the English Civil War in the 1640s and the Orthodox Church of England. So they sought to recreate English life in America. They didn't want to have some new society or create something different. They wanted to recreate what they already had. And they settled in the South, mainly Virginia, Maryland, Catholics included, and the Carolinas. And this group of men would dominate Southern culture. Now, there was the Celtic influence as well, and also African influence, but the Cavalier, the ideas of the Cavalier and what it meant to be a man and how you should conduct yourself in society really dominated Southern culture in so many ways still to this day. They're mostly from the southern portion of England. Now, some very famous Cavaliers would include people like William Barkley, who lived from 1605 to 1677. He dominated the early Virginia colonial government and early Virginia social life. In fact, he was the royal governor of Virginia twice, from 1642 to 1644, and then again from 1661 to 1676. He was also a very good friend of King Charles I. Barkley detested democracy and hated the Puritans, and so the English Civil War in the 1640s, and you can see he's in Virginia, and then he actually fought in the English Civil War back over in England. But the English Civil War essentially was between royalists and parliamentarians or Puritans. And so what you had there were the Cavaliers against Puritans in England itself, and this hatred carried over into the colonies. So these two cultures were vastly different. And that idea that there's a southern culture and a northern culture was here apparent already in the 1600s. It didn't take the issue of slavery in the 1800s to make that apparent. People knew it in the 1600s. Another very famous Cavalier was a man named William Byrd II, lived from 1674 to 1744, had a plantation called Westover Plantation on the James River, which contained the finest library in Virginia. He was also the founder of Richmond, and he had something called the Royal Society of Great Britain. So here you have men in England trying to recreate English life, even their dress, their manners. We know a lot about Cavalier society because of William Byrd's diary that he kept, and so he documented very well and very accurately the life of Cavaliers in Virginia in the 18th century. There's his plantation home on the James River. We'll talk about the architecture in a minute, but this home is privately owned today. You can tour the grounds, but not go inside. Now, there are several aspects of a culture that make a culture what it is. And so what I'm going to do is go over some of these different elements and show how different they are across the four different areas. And so we're going to do the same categories for each culture. So we're going to start with speech. Now, the Cavalier speech was the origins of the Southern accent. It was a soft, slow, melodious drawl. And they had a very interesting vocabulary. They said bide for staying somewhere. They said howdy for hello, grit for courage, lick for beat, bellyache for stomach pain, favor for resemble, moonshine for distilled liquor, right good for very good, yonder for distant, a flapjack for a pancake. If you're out of work, you're laid off. If you're wearing a material of coarse twill weave, you're wearing jeans. This is very interesting because, of course, a lot of these things have found their way into our lexicon today. When it came to building, they built symmetrical brick structures, which were similar to English country houses. So again, they're trying to recreate what they had here, had in England here. So Green Spring, which was William Barkley's home, was like this. Westover, which I just showed you, William Byrd's home. The Stratford plantation home, which is a Lee family plantation home. And the Shirley plantation, which was the Hill Carter family. This home is still a working plantation. It's been there since 1614. So it's on the James River. I'll show you a picture of it. You can still go tour it. The Carter family was the most wealthy family in Virginia for a long period of time. So there's the Stratford plantation there in Virginia, the Lee family home. You can see it's symmetrical. Each side of the building, I circle with my mouse, is the same. And even the outbuildings, the separate working buildings, are the same. And that's the same way it is with the Shirley plantation. So you have the main plantation home, and then you have these symmetrical brick buildings on the exterior of the plantation, like exactly the same. So that was the point. You had the symmetrical brick building that was the same. And it's just amazing. This house was built in the late 1600s, and the same family has lived in it, still lives in it to this day. So imagine if your house that you lived in, your ancestors had lived in it for over 200 years. Going on 300 years. Now, marriage, of course, is the way people marry is often an element of culture. So in this particular situation, the patriarchal family and the sacred union then dominated the family, and marriage was indissoluble, meaning that you could not get a divorce. You had a Christian ceremony, and then if you didn't have the money, you could often have a broomstick wedding. So oftentimes you hear the tale of the broomstick wedding in the slave community. Well, this particular type of wedding actually came from Cavalier culture. And so when people didn't have the money or the means to have an official ceremony, they would have a broomstick wedding. You just jump over the broomstick and you're married. Feasting was the common element for Cavalier culture. They loved to eat. And it must be said, and we'll talk about that in a minute, it must be said that in Cavalier society, love was not necessary for marriage. Oftentimes, cousin marriage was common to keep land and money in the family. Women usually married between 18 and 20, men between 25 and 30. In terms of gender ways, in this society you usually had a devoted husband and a virtuous wife and a loving life together. There was a tremendous amount of outward affection, but men were the domestic patriarchs, and they told their wives how to look and how to act. They even asked questions like, did women have a soul, or were they the same thing as a dog? And so sometimes this would lead to stormy relationships. I put this rough music there. If a couple was having a fairly stormy time, they were fighting a lot and other things, and the community would actually rally around and bang pots and pans till they stopped fighting. So some people said that in this society you had unequal love, meaning that women loved their husbands more than men loved their wives. I don't think that's necessarily true, though men did have a much more freer time when it came to infidelity and other things. Men were not punished for adultery. Women could be beaten or dragged behind a boat through water. There were also fairly high rates of premarital pregnancy. In this society, men were predators and women were breeders who had to have sexual virtue. So again, the roles that you had and what men were allowed to do and what women were allowed to do often dictated a much more male-dominated society. When it came to rearing children, you had to bend the will. Children, particularly boys, were encouraged to exercise their will, but they also had to find their proper place in the social hierarchy. So boys had to learn not only how to be good men, which was hunting, the martial arts, things of that nature, be well educated, but they also had to learn how to dance and formal rules of conduct. So this is a very gallant and masculine society. That's one thing you can say about Cavalier society and Celtic society. It's very masculine. And this even carries over to this day in the South. Southerners, to a man, usually are much more interested in masculinity and traditional masculinity than anywhere else in the United States. Say perhaps the West. I mean, the West still has this, and that's often because Southerners populated the West. So this idea of a very masculine society very much comes out of Southern culture. Religious ways. These men belonged to the Orthodox Anglican Church, which was a very small parish church. So you had a parish, which is a community of people, the parishioners that go to a single church. Religion was seen as a devotional act, not a meeting and a lecture. So you went to church because you were devoted to the religion. You weren't there to conform society or make people act a certain way. You went to listen to the liturgy, to the Word of God, and that's why you went to church, for redemption, for salvation, not to formulate some type of way for people to live. Oftentimes the liturgies, in fact, are very short. So you had choir and organs, and of course afterwards you're going to go eat, which is carried over into Southern society today. Here's the Bruton Parish Church in Williamsburg, Virginia. George Washington attended this church, as did many other famous colonial leaders. It is also a symmetrical brick structure. It's actually a cross. So on this area here, if you could look at the other side, it looks exactly the same. The bell tower area was added later. You can even tell the difference in the brick. Now, foodways. What you see here is the origins of Southern cooking. So they ate a lot of beef, fresh vegetables, and fruit. They used a lot of high seasonings, and delicate flavors. They ate a lot of fried food. They didn't bake much. And meals could last all day. 7, 8, 9, 10-course meals. It was said that Virginians dined and Yankees just ate, and that's very true. Virginians looked at eating as an event, not just something to sit down and do to fill your belly. Dressways. The Virginians had a very opulent dress. Men would wear high heels, silk hose, pearly necklaces, or other jewelry, lace cuffs, puffy shirts, puffy shirt, feathered hats with slashes in the sleeves. The more slashes, you had more money. Servants wore blue and commoners wore simple clothes. In fact, blue jeans were not worn by most Southerners of status until the 20th century. If you were a man of status in the South, you wore slacks, a dress shirt, a tie, a coat all the time, because that showed your social status. Clothing supported a social inequality. So even though this was Lord John Stuart and his brother Bernard Stuart were in England, this is the kind of dress you might have had for the Cavaliers. Also notice the long hair. Men wore their hair long if you were in Cavalier society. The Puritans cut their hair short. This is a painting by Anthony Van Dyck in 1638. But Virginians often dressed like this too. Just go back to that Bacon picture that I had earlier in the slide. You can see the type of dress that Bacon was wearing. And same thing with Barkley or Byrd. In terms of sport, there was stratification in sport. Horse racing and betting were reserved to gentlemen alone. In fact, George Washington loved to gamble. He gambled on anything. And so Virginians liked to gamble. They also liked blood sports, which was fox hunting, cockfighting. This is why when Michael Vick, who's from Virginia, was in dog fighting rings, that blood sport idea went all the way back to the colonial period. It had nothing to do with race. It's the culture that they inherited here in Virginia from the Cavaliers. Field games were reserved for the best men in society, and so if you lost to somebody of lower status, what would that say about you? So you didn't race somebody who was not in the same social circles as you were. Shooting matches, things like that, these were also popular in Cavalier society. The ideal planter did not work. Which contributed to the theory that they had a low work ethic. So people called the society lazy. But planters did work fairly hard. Running a plantation was a big business, and they didn't engage in manual labor, and they didn't participate in commerce, which people called paper jobbing. You're shuffling paper. But running a plantation was difficult, and most worked harder than they admitted. Cavaliers liked to have money, but they hated to handle it. They didn't want it to seem like they were money grubbing, having a pocket full of cash. And they loved to show it off in ostentatious displays of wealth, which forced many people into high debt. Monroe, Jefferson, Madison, these men all had a lot of debt, personal debt, usually through land. They had a lot of land, and they had debt on that land. In fact, James Monroe was forced to sell off large tracts of his estate because he needed to pay for things at one point in his life. But this was a stratified society. The top class owned most of the land and held most of the wealth. James Monroe, by the way, was the President of the United States, the 5th President of the United States, also from Virginia. Now, in terms of order, again, this is a hierarchic society, so the offices came from the top down. You had your county sheriff, which was elected, but generally came from the top as well. The sheriff was the most important law enforcement official, and they could selectively enforce laws, and they were elected. So if the state passed a law or the crown passed a law that was egregious to the colonists, they would elect a sheriff who would refuse to enforce those laws, and essentially that's what happens. A law is only as good as people are willing to enforce it. So if nobody enforces it, then the law is not in effect. And so that's where the county sheriff became very important. But status affected punishment, and they did believe in the death penalty. You could say that disorderly conduct and drunkenness could be a crime, but only if you were a certain section of society. It was a violent society in all aspects. The gentleman dominated and inflicted the punishments, and punishment was there to maintain hierarchy. And last but not least, power and liberty. What you had in this society were the vestry and county offices, which was the oligarchic portion of it. So oligarchy meaning that power is held at the top groups, and they control the political power. Offices came from the top. They were very anti-democratic, and they believed in what's called hegemonic liberty, meaning that they believe in liberty, but only liberty that maintains control or power for them. Now, they did believe in self-government and minimal government. So this idea, even to this day in the South, because the Celts believe this stuff too, Southerners, to a man, are usually more interested in limited self-government or limited government than really any other section in the country, and that's inherited. I mean, this is part of the fabric of Southern society. It's been there since the 1600s. They did believe in the autonomous individual, securely in command of yourself and free from the slavery of others. So these are very independent people, and that's important to note. Independence was at the root or the heart of what these men thought about in society. All right, so that's the last slide for this presentation. We'll pick up with the rest of the South and the Celts in the next one. See you then.